A herd of elephants is moving toward water on a path they've walked 1,000 times. Partway there, without any obvious signal, they stop. They turn. They walk deliberately toward a scatter of bones on the ground that has nothing to do with where they were headed. This isn't the herd that lost someone here. In some documented cases, it's a completely unrelated family, elephants who never knew whoever these bones used to be. They stop anyway. They touch the skull with their trunks, carefully, along the jaw, along the tusks. And then, eventually, they move on and finish the walk to water they were already making. Here's what makes this worth taking seriously rather than writing off as elephants just being curious. There's nothing to gain here. No food, no water, no mates, no threat, no resource of any kind sitting in a pile of bones. Every minute spent standing over a skull is a minute not spent doing anything that improves survival in any conventional sense. And yet, it happens often enough, consistently enough, across different families and different individuals that researchers who've spent decades in the field started asking a real question instead of dismissing it as anecdote. What, specifically, is drawing them there? Cynthia Moss founded the Amboseli Elephant Research Project in Kenya in 1972, and it's still running today. More than 50 years of continuous observation of the same elephant families, generation after generation. That kind of timescale is what eventually made a real experiment possible. In 2006, researchers Karen McComb, Lucy Baker, and Moss herself designed a controlled test to find out exactly what elephants were responding to. They laid out different objects in front of wild elephants under controlled conditions. Elephant skulls, the skulls of other large animals, elephant ivory, and plain pieces of wood roughly matched for size. Then they measured, systematically, which objects the elephants actually investigated. The result was specific, not vague. Elephants showed significantly more interest in elephant skulls and elephant ivory than in any of the other objects. Not bones in general. Not anything large and unfamiliar sitting on the savanna. Elephant remains, specifically, pulled their attention in a way nothing else tested did. The way elephants physically investigate a skull adds another layer to this. Field researchers have repeatedly described the same specific behavior. Elephants running their trunk tips along the lower jaw, the tusks, the teeth. Precisely the features that are most individually distinctive on a living elephant, and the same parts elephants touch on each other during ordinary greetings. It looks less like random curiosity and more like an identification check, run on the one part of another elephant that might still tell you something about who they were. A separate, well-documented case adds real texture to what this looks like in the wild. In the mid-2000s, researchers including Iain Douglas-Hamilton tracked the death of an Amboseli matriarch named Eleanor. As she lay dying, and after she died, multiple separate elephant family groups, families with no known relation to Eleanor at all, altered their path to approach her, investigate her, and in some cases, stay nearby for extended periods before eventually moving on. And separately, researcher Joyce Poole, who trained under Moss, has documented elephants carrying dying or dead calves for long distances. In one case, an Amboseli elephant carried a dying newborn roughly 1,500 feet into a secluded grove of palms. Elephants have never been observed carrying a healthy calf that way. Whatever is happening only shows up around death specifically. There is a reason a system like this might be worth having in the first place, and it comes from a separate strand of Moss's research. In 2001, McComb, working again with Moss and colleagues Stuart Baker and Soila Sayalel, tested something specific. How well elephant families could tell a dangerous lion from a harmless one, just from its roar. The answer depended almost entirely on the age of the herd's matriarch. Families led by an older, more experienced matriarch reacted appropriately to the roar of a genuinely dangerous group of male lions, bunching defensively, moving to protect calves, while families led by a younger matriarch often failed to react appropriately at all, treating a real threat much like a harmless one. The older matriarch was not just older. She was carrying decades of accumulated irreplaceable social and ecological knowledge that the rest of the family relied on to survive. Losing an individual like that is not a minor loss to an elephant family. It is the loss of a reference library nothing else in the group can fully replace. That cost is not just theoretical either. In 2008, researchers Kathleen Gobush, Benazeth Mutayoba, and Samuel Wasser studied a Tanzanian elephant population that had lost most of its older females to heavy poaching decades earlier. Even with plenty of prime-aged females still present and still capable of reproducing, those groups showed measurably lower reproductive rates and elevated stress hormones for years afterward. The knowledge those older elephants carried did not transfer to whoever happened to be left behind. It was simply gone. That is the same evolutionary logic sitting underneath the skull investigation behavior itself. A species that has learned, the hard way, how expensive it is to lose the wrong individual has every reason to pay close attention to exactly who is gone. Seen against that backdrop, stopping to investigate a set of remains, checking specifically whether this was an elephant, whether it might have been someone who mattered, starts to look less like idle curiosity and more like exactly the kind of information an elephant family has every practical reason to track carefully. Here's where it's worth being precise instead of reaching for the tidiest version of this story, because the tidiest version isn't quite what the evidence supports. The controlled 2006 study found that elephants are drawn to elephant remains as a category, skulls and ivory from their own species specifically. What it did not find was any elevated interest in the remains of a specific deceased relative over the remains of an elephant they'd never known. The pull isn't measurably stronger for family. It's a response to elephant death in general, not a targeted response to the loss of someone specific. That doesn't make it less real. It changes what it actually is. Closer to a species-wide recognition of loss than a personal, individually directed grief the way a human might visit one particular grave and no other. It's also worth directly addressing something that gets repeated constantly and isn't well supported. Reports of elephants appearing to cry, visible wetness on the face near a body. The far more likely explanation is ordinary eye lubrication, not an emotional tear response. The timing just happens to line up in a way that reads as meaningful. Good evidence for something remarkable doesn't need help from evidence that isn't actually there. So why do elephants return to where a herd member died? Because somewhere in 50 years of watching them, researchers found a real, measurable, repeatable pattern. Elephants notice elephant death, specifically, and they stop what they're doing to acknowledge it, even when the elephant in question was a stranger to them. It isn't a targeted grief for one specific mother, one specific friend. It's something a little stranger than that, and arguably no less remarkable. A species that pauses, consistently, for its own dead, whoever they happen to be. The bones don't get buried. They don't need to be. Every elephant that walks past already knows to stop. Nothing about that pause is deliberate sentiment. It's what 50 years of evidence says an elephant brain does when it meets its own dead. You didn't choose most of what makes you what you are, but you can choose to understand it. New mechanism, always sourced, every week. Subscribe if you want to keep finding out what's actually making you tick.